Chapter 3 The Revolution Part 1 Origins. It was Woodrow Wilson who started the Indian Revolution. Did he know what he was doing when he scattered over every land his ringing phrases about democracy, self-government, and the rights of small nations? In every subject country, in Egypt and the Near East, in China and India, there were ears waiting for those words as a signal to revolt. They were the voice of the zeitgeist calling to all men to be free. Were not the Allies winning and destroying the last autocracy in Europe? Was not the whole world now safe for democracy? Those waiting spirits, of course, had been prepared. The ideology of liberty was not born in them overnight. Young Chinese, young Japanese, young Hindu had gone to Oxford and Cambridge, in London and Manchester, to Harvard and Columbia, to Princeton and Yale. In 1923, there were 1,094 Hindu students enrolled in the schools of England. They marveled at the privileges enjoyed by the lowliest citizens of Europe and America. They studied the French and American revolutions and read the liberal literature of reform, the radical literature of revolt. They gloated over the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the Declaration of Independence, and the American Constitution. They went back to their countries as centers of infection for democratic ideas and the gospel of liberty. The industrial and scientific advances of the West and the victory of the Allies in the war gave to these ideas an irresistible prestige. Soon, every student was shouting the battle cry of freedom. In the schools of England and America, the Hindus learned to be free. And did Macaulay foresee, when he ordained that all higher education in India should use the English language, that the Hindus would learn nationalism and democracy with English? If all great literature, as Thomas Hardy said, is the voice of reason in revolt, how could the young Hindu read the literature of England and America without being corrupted and exalted with the aspiration to freedom? At last, the English in India, seeing the mischief that was brewing, forbade the teaching of European history of the 18th century in Indian schools. But they had waited too long. These Western-educated Orientals had not only taken on political ideas in the course of their education abroad, they had shed religious ideas. The two processes are usually associated in the individual and in history. They came to Europe as pious youths, wedded to Buddha, Krishna, Shiva, Vishnu, Kali, Kunjin, and whatnot. They touched science, and their ancient faith was shattered as if by a sudden electrical dissolution. Shorn of religious belief, which is the very spirit of India, the westernized Hindus returned to their country disillusioned and sad. 1,000 gods had dropped dead from the skies. They became pessimists and cynics like our own youth in the West today. They had nothing to believe. Inevitably, utopia filled the place of heaven. Democracy became a substitute for nirvana. Liberty replaced God. What had gone on in Europe in the second half of the 18th century went on now in the East. Nevertheless, the new ideas developed slowly before the war. In 1885, a few Hindu leaders met at Bombay and founded the Indian National Congress. But they do not seem at that time to have dreamed even of home rule. Those leaders were mostly of the middle and business class. They accepted British rule in India as they accepted the behavior of the sun. They recognized many benefits in that rule. What they wanted was not independence, but a share in the government, its dignities, its powers, and perhaps its spoils. The British office holders could not understand this point of view. They froze the movement with cold stares and references to the future. Instead, the Viceroy, Lord Curzon, proclaimed in 1905 his intention to partition Bengal, thereby destroying the unity and strength of the most conscious and powerful community in India. The result was the development of a more rebel mood, and the appearance of blunt leaders like the uncompromising Tilak, who, at the All India National Congress of 1905, announced to the excited delegates that India must have Swaraj. He had created the word out of Sanskrit roots, still visible in its English translation, self rule. Not content with that, the old tiger threatened that if Curzon persisted in the partition of Bengal, India would retaliate with Swadeshi, the boycott of foreign goods. In that same eventful year, Japan defeated Russia like another David slaying Goliath, and the East, which for a century had been fearful of the West, took heart and began to think of all Asia liberating itself from the guns of Europe. It was in 1905 then that the Indian Revolution began. Part 2. A Stroke of Politics. In its earlier stages, it tended to imitate Russian methods. Bombs were exploded, shots were fired, and the demands were often in inverse proportion to the strength of the rebels. With the arrival of Gandhi in 1914 and the outbreak of the World War, the situation changed. Gandhi, the idealist, did not realize that the subjection of India was one root of the war, that this had for a century determined British policy and the size of the British Navy, as well as the size of all the navies in the world. Instead, Gandhi saw the war as an opportunity for securing home rule by proving the absolute loyalty of India to England. From the beginning to the end of Great Madness, he supported the Allies and India followed him. She contributed at once $500 million to the fund for prosecuting the war. She contributed $700 million later in subscriptions to war loans, and she sent to the Allies various products to the value of $1,250 million. The suspension of the revolution movement enabled England to reduce the Indian army to 15,000 men. The total number of Hindus who were persuaded, often by means amounting to compulsion, to fight for England in the war was 1,338,620, being 178,000 more than all the troops contributed by the combined dominion of Canada, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. None of the Hindu soldiers was granted a commission, however brave he might have proved himself to be. Yet, they gave a good account of themselves in France, in Palestine, in Syria, and Mesopotamia. A British historian speaks of the brilliant performances of the Indian contingent sent to France in 1914 at a critical time in the Great War. And some say it was the Hindu troops who first turned back the Germans at the Marne. Indian soldiers were sent even to China to fight unwillingly against their Asiatic brothers. The legislatures at Delhi questioned the government about this, but the government refused to answer. It has been one of the many misfortunes of the Hindus, who are called unfit for self-defense, that they have been considered admirable military material to fight for any others except themselves. Never had a colony or a possession made so great a sacrifice for the master country. Every Hindu conscious of India looked forward hopefully now as a reward for this bloody loyalty to the admission of his country into the fellowship of free dominions under the English flag. Indeed, in 1917, when the position of England in the war was critical and enthusiasm for the cause of democracy needed stimulation, Mr. Edwin Montagu, Secretary of State for India, made the following announcement in the House of Commons. The policy of His Majesty's government, with which the government of India are in complete accord, is that of the increasing association of Indians in every branch of the administration and the gradual development of self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India as an integral part of the British Empire. They have decided that substantial steps in this direction should be taken as soon as possible, and that it is one of the highest importance as a preliminary to considering what these steps should be, that there should be a free and informal exchange of opinion between those in authority at home and in India. His Majesty's government have accordingly decided, with His Majesty's approval, that I should accept the Viceroy's invitation to proceed to India to discuss the matters with the Viceroy and the Government of India, to consider with the Viceroy the views of local governments and to receive with him the suggestions of representative bodies and others. I would add that progress in this policy can only be achieved by successive stages. The British government and the Government of India, on whom the responsibility lies for the welfare and advancement of the Indian peoples, must be judges of the time and measure of each advance, and they must be guided by the cooperation received from those upon whom new opportunities of service will thus be conferred, and by the extent to which it is found that confidence can be reposed in their sense of responsibility. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Montagu visited India, and in collaboration with the Viceroy, Lord Chelmsford, drew up the reforms known by their names. The Secretary wished to carry out his promises liberally, but the Viceroy proved to be an obstinate conservative. These things might do, he said, a generation or two hence. Nor did the government in London encourage Montagu the war over. It regretted his promise and sought devices and phrases that would break it while seeming to keep it. Lloyd George, then Premier, declared with unstatesmanlike clarity that Britain intended always to rule India, that there must always remain in India a steel frame of British power and British dominance. Some time previously, Lord Curzon had written, "British rule of the Indian people is England's present and future task. It will occupy her energies for as long a span of the future as it is humanly possible to forecast." And Lord Birkenhead was to say in 1925, "I am not able in any foreseeable future to discern a moment when we may safely either to ourselves or India abandon our trust." The last word observed the best traditions of imperialistic hypocrisy. Therefore, the reforms fell far short of what Montagu had hoped for. They established first the system of diarchy, by which each province would have two ministries, one responsible to the provincial legislature and having no powers of any account, the other responsible only to the British authorities and having all the fundamental powers. Any act of the provincial legislature could be overruled by the governor, and any act of the governor, if he considered it necessary to the interest of the empire, could be passed by decree over the heads of the legislatures. A similar arrangement castrated the Central Assembly. Here too, the only right was to speak. All authority remained with the Viceroy. He was empowered to enact any measure which might seem necessary to him, even if it must be over a unanimous adverse vote of the Assembly. He could collect taxes which the Assembly had refused to vote. He controlled the expenditures, taxation, and defense, and was free to pay salaries and pensions denied by the Assembly. When this remarkable form of progressive self-government reached England, a member of Parliament, Dr. Rutherford said of it, "Never in the history of the world was such a hoax perpetrated upon a great people as England perpetrated upon India. When in return for India's invaluable service during the war, we gave to the Indian nation such a discreditable, disgraceful, undemocratic, tyrannical constitution." The Tories have answered that it would have been unwise to give more power to legislatures elected by so illiterate a people, forgetting that 1/5 of the Assembly and 1/2 of the Upper House, the Council of State, were named by the British government, that the Lower House was elected by a franchise open to 1 out of 250 in the population, and the Council was half elected by a franchise still further whittled down. Finally, the voters were divided into sectarian groups: Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Europeans, etc. They were given representation bearing little relation to their numbers, and each candidate presented himself not to all the citizens in his community but only to his fellow sectarians. As Josiah Wedgwood, then a member of parliament, said of the reforms, the very idea of India vanished from the bill, to be replaced by the disunited communities of Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Maratha, Brahmin, non-Brahmin, Indian Christian, Anglo-Indian, and English. It was claimed that such a plan was necessary to protect the Muslims from the Hindus, who outnumber them almost 5-1. In practice, however, it is the Hindus who need protection from the Muslims. The actual result was the increasing division of India into a score of hostile groups. It was a result admirably suited to an alien ruler who no doubt had not intended it. It is a coincidence that Lieutenant Colonel John Cook, commandant at Muradabad, advised that British government shortly before it took over India from the company, our endeavours should be uphold in full force the separation, for us fortunate, which exists between the different religions and races, not to endeavour to amalgamate them. Divide et impera should be the principle of Indian government. To rule your subjects, divide them. It was another coincidence that the British governor of Bombay in 1859 sent to his government this word of counsel. Divide et impera was the old Roman motto, and it should be ours. It was also a coincidence that Sir John Stache wrote, "The existence, side by side, of hostile creeds among the Indian people is one of the strong points in our political position in India. A government must not be held responsible for the inadvertent honesty of its representatives." Against the reforms, no Hindu could do anything except protest by tongue or pen, but that was a right not guaranteed to him. The reforms did not ensure to the Hindus freedom of speech or of assembly or of the press or the right of trial in open court or the privilege of habeas corpus or any other of the essential rights and privileges which are the foundation and indispensable guarantee of liberty, justice, and law. When protests were tried, and Hindu press began to voice its suspicion that India had been deceived, the government at Delhi issued in 1919 the Rowlatt Acts, reimposing upon India all those restrictions of assembly, press, and speech that had been in effect during the war. The acts proclaimed that hereafter the government might arrest without notice or warrant any suspected person and detain them without trial as long as it liked. That such trial as might be given was to be in secret before not a jury but 3 judges appointed by the government, that the accused need not to be told the names of his accuser nor of the witnesses against him, that these should not be required to confront him, that the accused must not be allowed the right of engaging a lawyer to defend him, that he must not call witnesses in his behalf, that usual legal procedures might be abrogated, and that no appeal would be permitted. An Indian scholar showed that these were almost precisely the rules of the Spanish Inquisition. The acts were later repealed. Part 3. A Whiff of Grapeshot. The last blow was the massacre of Amritsar. Since all news of this event remained hidden from the world and even from Parliament for several months after its occurrence, and since the slaughter was the proximate cause of the revolution of 1921, let us inquire into the details. In the now famous city of Punjab, meetings were held to protest against the Rowlatt Acts, and on March 30th and April 6th, 1919, hurtals were successfully declared. All business in the city stopping throughout those days as a sign of popular dissatisfaction with the government. There was no disorder, says an English clergyman resident in India, and Europeans passed unmolested among the crowds. It was a fine sample of non-violent and non-cooperation. On the 9th of April, the government arrested Doctors Kichlu and Satyapal, who had addressed the protest meetings. When word of this spread, a great crowd poured into the street. Part of it tried to force its way through the police lines to register with the deputy commissioner their protest against the arrest of the leaders. Some in the crowd threw stones at the police. The police answered with bullets and 10 men were killed. Infuriated by the sight of these dead, the crowd lost all order, destroyed property, and killed 5 Englishmen. A women missionary was set upon and beaten, but was carried to safety by some Hindus. Indians of education tried to pacify the crowd, but failed. Indian officers in the city volunteered their services to the government. On the 10th and 11th, his 600 troops arrived. On the 12th, Brigadier General Dyer came and took command. By that day, quiet had been restored, and such crowds as gathered were peaceably dispersed. General Dyer made several arrests, and on the 13th he summoned the people by call of the drums, and had read to them a proclamation forbidding them to leave the city without a pass, or to organize processions, or to gather in groups of more than 3. Meanwhile, 10,000 Hindus from outlying districts who had little, if any, knowledge of this proclamation collected in the enclosure known as Jallianwala Bagh and proceeded to celebrate a religious festival. The Bagh was an extinct garden and surrounded with high walls on every side and entered by a few narrow passages. Informed of this meeting, General Dyer proceeded to the spot with a detachment of troops equipped with Lewis machine guns and armored cars. Entering the Bagh, he saw the crowd and concluded that it had met in violation of his orders. Without giving the slightest warning or affording the assemblage any opportunity to indicate its pacific intentions, he ordered his troops to fire upon the imprisoned mass. And, though the crowd made no resistance, but shouted its horror and despair and pressed in panic against the gates, the general ordered the firing to continue until all the ammunition the soldiers had brought with them was exhausted. He personally directed the firing towards the exits, where the crowd was most dense. The targets, he declared, were good. The massacre lasted for over 10 minutes. When it was over, 1,500 Hindus were left on the ground, 400 of them dead. Dyer forbade his soldiers to give any aid to the injured, and by ordering all Hindus off the streets for 24 hours, prevented relatives or friends from bringing even a cup of water to the wounded who were piled up in the field. A reign of official terror followed. General Dyer issued an order that Hindus using the street in which the women missionary had been beaten should crawl on their bellies. If they tried to rise to all fours, they were stuck by the butts of the soldiers' guns. He arrested 500 professors and students and compelled all students to present themselves daily for roll calls, though this required that many of them should walk 16 miles a day. He had hundreds of citizens and some schoolboys quite innocent of any crime flogged in the public square. He built an open cage, unprotected from the sun, for the confinement of arrested persons. Other prisoners he bound together with ropes and kept in open trucks for 15 hours. He had lime poured upon the naked bodies of sadhus, saints, and then exposed them to the sun rays that the lime might harden and crack their skin. He cut off the electric and water supplies from Indian houses and ordered all electric fans possessed by Hindus to be surrendered and given gratis to the British. Finally, he sent airplanes to drop bombs upon men and women working in the fields. The news of this barbaric orgy of military sadism was kept from the world for half a year. A belated commission of inquiry appointed by the government rendered an equivocal report. A committee appointed by Indian National Congress made a more thorough investigation and reported 1,200 killed and 3,600 wounded. General Dyer was censured by the House of Commons, exonerated by the House of Lords, and was retired on a pension. Thinking this reward insufficient, the militarists of the empire raised a fund of $150,000 for him and presented him with a jeweled sword of honor. Part 4. the Revolt of 1921. When he heard of Amritsar, Tagore wrote the following letter to the Viceroy, enclosing the knighthood which had been conferred upon him by the British government. The enormity of the measures taken by government in Punjab for quelling some local disturbances has, with a rude shock, revealed to all minds of helplessness of our position as British subjects in India. The disproportionate severity of punishments inflicted upon the unfortunate people and the methods of carrying them out, we are convinced, are without parallel in the history of civilized governments, barring some conspicuous exceptions recent and remote. Considering that such treatments has been meted out to a population disarmed and resourceless by a power which has the most terribly efficient organization for destruction of human lives, we must strongly assert that it can claim no political expediency, far less moral justification. The accounts of insults and sufferings undergone by our brothers have trickled through the gagged silence, reaching every corner of India, and the universal agony of indignation roused in the hearts of our people has been ignored by our rulers, possibly congratulating themselves for imparting what they imagined a salutary lesson. The time has come when badges of honor make our shame glaring in the incongruous context of humiliation, and I, for my part, wish to stand shorn of all special distinction by the side of my countrymen, who, for their so-called insignificance, are liable to suffer a degradation not fit for human beings. At the same time, Gandhi sent a similar letter to Viceroy, returning the decorations he had received for services to the empire in Africa and during the war. On November 4th, the National Congress at Delhi, at his suggestion, issued a call for peaceful mass civil disobedience, that is, for boycott of all British goods, the refusal of all taxes, and the abandonment of all forms of association or cooperation between Hindus and the government. The British government thought to mollify resentment by having the Prince of Wales come to India, but when the prince arrived at Bombay on November 17th, the city declared a hartal, or closing of all business, and left the heir to 320 million Hindus to face empty streets and shut windows. Only the English and a few ambitious Parsi merchants appeared. When the people heard of these latter recalcitrants, they poured out from their hovels and, with the characteristically uncontrolled and multiplying rage of the crowd, set fire to the homes of the merchants and killed 53 men. Gandhi at Ahmedabad heard the news with dismay. Could it be that his people were as brutal as the British? He rushed to Bombay and told the crowd, which had greeted him with wild applause, and they had committed an outrage that almost lowered them to the level of General Dyer. He went back to his ashram a disillusioned man. His people were not prepared for a pacific revolution like the rest of humanity. They were still too near the beast. He fasted and prayed and was encouraged to learn that the prince had found Calcutta a dead city, that there the hartal had been carried out with unanimity and without violence. But at Mopla in the south and Chauri Chaura in the north came two of the blackest events of the first revolt. The divisions between Muslims and Hindus had suddenly become more violent than before. The revival of Hinduism by Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, and Arya Samaj had widened the gap between the rival sects. Reactionary Hindus played music before mosques, which are not intended to hear music. In some part of India, they classed Muslims with untouchables. Since the Prophet had forbidden the charging of interest, many Mohammedans were in debt to Hindu usurers. The Muslims disapproved of graven images of deity. The Hindus filled the streets with them. The Muslims believed in but one God and buttoned their coats to the left. The Hindus believed in 1,000 gods and buttoned their coats to the right. From 1923 to 1927, the riots between these two schools of theology caused 450 lives and 5,000 injuries. The bloodiest of these disagreements occurred at Mopla on the Malabar coast in the south of India in August 1921. The Moplas were simple Muslims who believed that every murdered Hindu was pleasing in the sight of God. Angered by the British treatment of the Mohammedans in the Near East, they rose against the local officials of the government and killed 7 of them. Ashamed of their moderation and finding no other whites to land, they turned upon the Hindu, to whom they owed money, butchered hundreds of them, and circumcised other hundreds of them, male and female. And at Chorachori in February 1922, 27 police who had tried to stop a nationalist procession were attacked, driven into their barracks, and burned to death. The government retaliated for these acts of violence by arresting 250,000 men and women. Gandhi now performed an act of moral courage hardly paralleled in history. He had been empowered by the last National Congress to begin and to end non-cooperation when he should think best. He knew now that many elements in the revolutionary movement secretly rejoiced in the violence at Chorachori and Bombay. The Hindus had proved that they were not cowards. They too could kill. He knew that these younger leaders had no faith in revolution by peace, but were anxious to come to violent grips with the enemy. And he suspected that they looked upon these outbursts of Hindus as the first event in a successful violent revolution. But he did not believe that a violent revolution could ever be successful. He had made up his mind that he would rather fail without violence than win with it. He astonished all India and all England by issuing instructions to nationalists everywhere that the non-cooperation movement was to abandon at once. A cry of protest came from hundreds of his subordinates. They could not understand. They were convinced that their leader had ruined the revolution. And yet that brief revolt had accomplished things hitherto considered impossible. A people overgiven to meditation and prayer, too immersed in other worlds, too ready to accept slavery as Maya, a superficial matter of no importance or reality, had been persuaded, even too suddenly, to turn their thoughts to the earth. A nation which many had looked upon as exhausted and finished had risen like a lusty youth. A people without patriotism and without national consciousness, because divided into 100 provinces, languages, races, and creeds, had been welded into unprecedented unity. The Hindus stiffened a little and began to look their masters in the face. The English bent a little and became more attentive to their serfs. It was evident to all that the revolution had but begun. Between revolutions. The influence of Gandhi might have been destroyed by his self-denying ordinance had not the authorities arrested him soon after his announcement. Now, though his authority had fallen with the leaders, it rose with the people. They hailed him as a martyr and a saint and put his pictures in their huts along with the images of the gods. One poster circulated by his followers showed him as the unchallenged center of a group composed also of Buddha, Krishna, Christ, Tolstoy, Lenin, and McSweeney. When in 1924 Gandhi was released, he found his power broken. A new set of leaders had arisen who called themselves the Swaraj Party and aimed to secure the home rule through participation in and legal political capture of the government. Those who understood the English smiled at this, but Gandhi was so weakened by failure, fasting, imprisonment, and an operation that he gave a mild consent to the new policy and retired for years into the obscurity of his ashram. The new guides of India were of many kinds. There was Chittaranjan Das, head of Swarajits, a man of passionate devotion who gave every ounce of his strength to the movement and died of overwork in the prime of life. He thought the Charkha romantic and yet feared the possibility that Hindu freedom might be merely a change from foreign to domestic exploiters. He dreaded the development of the factory system in India and hoped that industry might be spread out through the villages and its ownership distributed to the point where it would lack the power to dominate the government. He was an ardent moderate. "We want to remain within the empire," he said, "if that is not inconsistent with establishing our own system of government. It is the only lack of vision of the British policy which is driving some of our young men to think of going outside of the empire." The older leaders like Mrs. Annie Besant, an Englishwoman who had lived in India since 1893, became more conscious with every grey hair and, while calling for Home Rule, insisted that the approach to it should be not merely peaceful but fully in accord with law. Great barristers like Madan Mohan Malviya, Motilal Nehru, and Vallabhbhai Patel, who became President of Assembly at Delhi, exerted their influence to keep the movement within the bounds of law. But the younger Nehru, Jawaharlal, destined to be one of the major leaders in 1930, refused to commit himself to the avoidance of violence. Laws made by alien tyrants were not to be respected as laws. A small circle of communists looked to Russia as a model. A fraction of the industrial workers in the city organized long strikes, and these two groups formed a red fringe on the nationalist movement. Picturesque as any was Sarojini Naidu, representative of the liberated minority among the women of India, poetess and revolutionary, and fiery orator. See her inflaming with her wild spirit the National Congress which had elected her president. Come, my general, come, my soldiers. I am only a woman, only a poet. But as a woman, I give to you the weapons of faith and courage and the shield of fortitude. And as a poet, I fling out the banner of song and sound, the bugle call to battle. How shall I kindle the flame which shall waken you, men, from slavery? Part 6. The Simon Commission. Into this cauldron of souls came the Simon Commission. The Montego-Chelmsford reforms had been tentative, and the British Parliament had arranged to send a commission of inquiry to India after a decade of the reforms to report on their operation, their success or failure, and their possible improvement. The commission, appointed by a conservative ministry, consisted of 3 conservatives, 2 liberals, and 2 Labour members of Parliament. They sailed for India in January 1928. The Hindus had looked forward to this commission as promising to uncover for the British people the defects of the reforms and the practical enslavement of India. They were astounded to find out that no Hindu had been appointed to its membership. They felt that they could not look for a sympathetic understanding of their situation from men, all of them English, most of them conservative, and all of them profiting indirectly from the British control of Indian finances and Indian trade. The Hindu leaders of all groups and sects announced that so far as they had influence, India would boycott this commission. They would not lend themselves to the farce of being judged by their enemies. When the commission landed at Bombay on February 3, 1928, it found the city flying everywhere black flags as a sign of mourning. Business was suspended, the shop windows were shuttered, and the Hindu-owned newspaper had stopped publication for the day. Sir John Simon attempted to undo the mischief by issuing on his arrival an invitation to the Indian Assembly to appoint from its membership an Indian Central Committee to sit with the Simon Commission on its second visit to India. Some moderates responded, but India paid no attention to them. Wherever the commission went, it was ignored by all those elements in India which desired freedom, and on its appearance, great hotels were declared in the cities. At the end of March, it left India. It returned in October 1928 and remained until April 1929. The boycott still continued. The report of the commission, to which the liberals of the world had looked for some solution of the problem, how India might be free and yet remain content within the empire, accepting the compromises necessary to avert a panic in British industry and trade, appeared in 1930 and was received with an amazed disappointment throughout the world. It was made evident as the survey of surface phenomena was followed by recommendations which were less liberal than the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, and the Commission had been unable to rise above a natural resentment at its reception to a sympathetic view of India as, in basic fact, under the heel of England, and that the Conservatives had tried to use the Commission to tighten their grip upon India. It became necessary for the MacDonald government to exclude all members of the Commission from the Roundtable Conference of English and Hindus, which had been called for October 1930. Observers in India agreed that the work of MacDonald and Lord Irwin in pacifying India had been made far more difficult by the Simon Report. The essence of the report, so surrounded with historical and argumentative minutes that only political experts recognize it as fundamental, is the recommendation that the central legislature should be elected no longer by the people, but by the provincial legislatures, that the powers of this federal assembly should be severely reduced to leave each province almost independent of the central government, and that the power of the provincial governors and of the viceroy should remain as broad as before. This subtle proposal for the further disunion of India is quoted with a suggestion that the franchise of the election of the provincial legislatures shall be extended from the 3% of the population now permitted to vote to 10%. It suggests that in addition to the property qualification now attached to the franchise, an educational requirement shall be added. If a certain minimum of education had been made the sole test, it would have been a very fair proposal. However, it would have had the disastrous effect of filling the legislatures with men devoted to freedom. Communal elections are to be continued. It is true that they might be replaced, as in America, by constitutional safeguards against the oppression of religious minorities, but they are now more indispensable than ever to the disunity of India. The system of diarchy is to be abolished, and the security which it guaranteed to British interests will be protected by the overriding powers of the governor. The governor of each province is not to be elected, of course. He is to be appointed by the British authorities, and he is to remain free to overrule his legislature whenever this seems to him necessary. The Federal Assembly is to consist of two houses, to each of which the Viceroy will appoint a substantial proportion of its membership. The ratio of Hindus to the British in Indian civil service is not to be raised. The federal delegates will be responsible not to the people, but to the provincial legislatures. Their membership is to include representatives from the 700 native states. Of these, being under native autocrats do not want home rule in India. The Viceroy has the privilege, as before, of overruling the Assembly whenever in his judgment the interests of the British Empire are affected. Since India is subject to invasion from without and sectarian disorders within, like America, its army must remain, at any rate for a long time to come, under the control and direction of agents of the imperial government. This is obvious, for if the Indian army should be under the control of the country which provides nearly all of its soldiers and all of its funds, the relations between England and India would have to be friendly. Part 7, 1930. In December 1928, the All India National Congress held a fateful meeting at Calcutta. It had now a dues-paying membership of 510,276 and an attendance of 15,000 men and women from every section of India. Shortly before, the Viceroy, Lord Irwin, had sought to appease discontent by promising India home rule in the future. But as this was no more than Mr. Montagu had promised 11 years back, the Hindu leaders returned his note as being worthless without a date. Sick of these vague references to the future, promises apparently made in the hope that things would blow over, the Congress of Calcutta served notice that unless Dominion status were granted to India by the end of 1929, placing her on an equality with Canada, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, the members of the Congress pledged themselves to inaugurate on January 1st, 1930, a movement for complete independence. If India could not be treated like Canada, it would seek freedom like the United States. Gandhi pled with the Congress to make the interval 2 years instead of 1. It refused, and he accepted its decision. On New Year's Day of 1930, the National Congress met at Lahore. It observed that the government had made no advance toward the liberation of India except to announce on November 1st, 1929, that Great Britain proposed to call a roundtable conference to discuss a new constitution for India. Asked if the new constitution would give dominion status, Lord Irwin had replied that it was intention of His Majesty's government to give India dominion status ultimately. The Congress expressed its understanding of this word by empowering Gandhi and an executive committee to declare, at their discretion, the opening of the campaign for freedom. After an interval of modest retirement, Gandhi had been accepted once more as the leader of India. On March 6th, he called the Indian people to another trial of satyagraha and ahimsa, civil disobedience without violence, and he wrote to the viceroy explaining his action. Before embarking on civil disobedience, I would fain approach you and find a way out. I cannot intentionally hurt anything that lives, much less fellow human beings. While therefore I hold British rule a curse, I do not intend to harm a single Englishman or any legitimate interest he may have in India. I do not consider Englishmen in general to be worse than any other people on earth. I have the privilege of claiming many Englishmen as my dearest friends. Why do I regard British rule as a curse? It has impoverished the dumb millions by a system of progressive exploitation and by the ruinously expensive military and civil administration which the country cannot afford. It has reduced us politically to serfdom. The Viceroy replied very briefly. His Excellency regrets to learn that you contemplate a course of action which is clearly bound to involve violation of the law and danger to the public peace. On March 12th, Gandhi began his march to the sea. He stopped at villages on the way and instructed the people not to pay the salt tax, which weighed so heavily upon the millions. On April 16th, he reached the coast and made salt by evaporating ocean water, thus violating a government monopoly. On the 9th, two of his sons were arrested. On the 14th, the younger Nehru, president of the National Congress, was arrested for manufacturing salt, and Sen Gupta, mayor of Calcutta, was imprisoned for sedition. On May 3rd, Gandhi was, for the second time, sent to jail. Meanwhile, the people were showing heroism hardly precedented in history. At Peshawar, on April 23rd, a crowd gathered in protest against the arrest of local nationalist leaders. The official reports of what followed stated that 20 people were killed in a riot. The report of Abdul Kasuri, president of Punjab Provincial Congress Committee, was smuggled through the censorship. As its simple story proceeds, these distant things cease to phrases and become realities of flesh and flowing blood. There had been absolutely no disorder, and not the least cause given to the authorities to fear that there would be any. The crowd had been behaving throughout in an exemplary manner. While the crowd was returning towards the city, two armored cars full of soldiers came from behind without blowing the horn or giving any notice whatever of their approach and drove into the crowd regardless of consequences. Many people were brutally run over, several were wounded, and at least 3 died on the spot. In spite of the provocation, the crowd still behaved with great restraint. At this time, an English officer on a motorcycle came dashing past. As to what happened to him, it is not quite clear. There are 2 conflicting versions. The semi-government version says that he flared into the crowd and one of the persons who was wounded by the shot struck him on the head and he died. The other version is that he collided with the motor car. At the same time, one of the armored cars caught fire. It is alleged on the one hand that it was set fire to by the mob. The other version is that it caught fire accidentally. A troop of English soldiers had reached the spot and without any warning began firing into the crowd, in which there were women and children. Now the crowd gave a good example of lessons of non-violence that had been instilled into them. When those in front fell down wounded, Those behind came forward with their breasts bared and exposed themselves to the fire. Some people got as many as 21 bullet wounds in their bodies. All the young people stood their ground without getting into a panic. A young Sikh boy came and stood in front of a soldier and asked him to fire at him, which the soldier unhesitatingly did, killing him. Similarly, an old woman, seeing her relations and friends being wounded, came forward, was shot, and fell down wounded. An old man with a 4-year-old child on his shoulders advanced, asking the soldiers to fire at him. He was taken at his words, and he also fell down wounded. Scores of such instances will come out on further inquiry. The crowd kept standing at the spot and were fired at from time to time until there were heaps of dead and dying lying about. The Anglo-Indian paper of Lahore, which represents the official view, wrote to the effect that the people came forward one after another to face the firing, and when they fell wounded, they were dragged back and others came forward. This state of things continued from 11 o'clock to 5 p.m. Two facts are noteworthy. There was not one single instance where there was the mark of a bullet at the back. Neither the police nor the military nor anybody else alleges that there was any stick or weapon blunt or sharp with the persons in the crowd, nor were any wrenched from any person by the authorities. At this stage, it is very difficult to say what is the number of the dead and wounded. This much seems most likely the number of the dead is in hundreds, and a careful study of the situation seems to disclose the incident to be a repetition of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. At Dharasan, the Satyagrahi, or revolutionists pledged to peace, expressed the feeling of India that a vital necessity like salt should not be taxed by attempting to walk up to salt pans and carry away what they needed. It was a little illogical, for they do not seem to have offered any payment. The police, stolid Hindus from Surat under British officers, did their best to repel the advance without violence. They held great bamboo sticks or lathis, 6 feet long with steel knobs on the end, over the heads of the vanguard, and threatened them. When the advance persisted, the police struck. The revolutionists made no resistance but continued to approach the police until their front ranks fell unconscious from repeated blows. A corps of stretcher bearers had come prepared, and while these carried away the fallen, the second rank advanced to the police without raising an arm or carrying any weapon. They too were struck on the head, in the abdomen, and in the face until they fell. This continued for hours till hundreds lay unconscious and bleeding on the ground, on stretchers, or in neighboring homes. Mr. Webb Miller, European news manager of the United Press and eyewitness, writes, "In 18 years of reporting in 22 countries, during which I have witnessed innumerable civil disturbances, riots, street fights, and rebellions, I have never witnessed such harrowing scenes as at Dharasana. The Western mind can grasp violence returned by violence, can understand a fight, but is, I found, perplexed and baffled by the sight of men advancing coldly and deliberately and submitting to beating without attempting defense. Sometimes the scenes were so painful that I had to turn away momentarily. One surprising feature was the discipline of the volunteers. It seemed they were thoroughly imbued with Gandhi's non-violence creed. At Bombay on June 19th and 21st, their strange capacity to suffer without striking back as a mute sign of India's new pride and resolution was demonstrated again. Orderly battalions of Satyagrahi, men and women, marched up in succession to Maidan Esplanade to hold a meeting forbidden by the government and allowed themselves to be beaten down unconscious by the Maharathi police. Powerful Sikhs, armed with great swords, joined with these Satyagrahis and refusing to defend themselves, allowed their heads to be beaten until they fell to the ground with blood streaming from their mouths. No one in India had thought that this warlike race would accept the counsels of Gandhi. These were scenes unknown in history since the Colosseum. It was as if the primitive Christians were once again fighting with silent suffering against an oppressive Rome. Throughout these pitiful massacres, one could still sympathize with the police. They had been told to prevent a violation of the law. They could not be expected to distinguish between law made by the representatives of India and law imposed upon 320 million Hindus by a few invading foreigners. They only knew how to obey. They seemed reluctant to strike. It was noticeable that when the officers were occupied on other parts of the line, the police slackened, only to resume threatening and beating when the officers appeared again. But in many cases, the brutality without which no man would be allowed to be a policeman in India appeared in most repulsive forms. One eyewitness reports the police snatch off the man's garments, twist and squeeze the testicles, and even batter them until their victim foam at the mouth and become unconscious. This incredible story is corroborated by another witness apparently above suspicion. On June 12th, Miss Madeline Slade, an Englishwoman of high standing, daughter of an admiral in the British Navy, printed in Gandhi's weekly, Young India, the following account of what she had been at Dharasana, items either not included in the United Press report or expunged from it by the censor. During these days, when the authorities in Whitehall and Simla are never tired of extolling the behavior of the police, I thought I would go and see for myself how this exemplary behavior has affected the Satyagrahis at Dharasana. I reached Bulsar at midday on June 6th, just as the wounded were being brought in there from the raid of the morning. Many of them were being carried on stretchers. Others could just struggle from the motors to hospital wards. The beating and torturing has been most merciless today, said the doctors and attendants. I proceeded around the room to visit the Satyagrahis more closely and to take notes from doctors as to the nature of their wounds. Literally, I felt my skin to creep and my hair to stand on end as I saw those brave men who, but a few hours previously, had gone forth absolutely unarmed, vowed to non-violence, now lying here before me, battered and broken from head to foot. Here was a young man with his shoulders and buttocks so beaten that he could not lie on his back, yet his arms and sides were so damaged that he did not know how to turn for rest. There was another gasping for breath with his chest badly battered, and nearby was a strong, tall Mussulman lying utterly helpless. What are his damages? I asked. He has received fearful blows on stomach and back and right leg, they replied. Also his testicles are both swollen, having been badly squeezed by the police. We went upstairs. Here my attention was attracted by the sounds of sharp-drawn whistling breathing, intermixed with heart-rending groans. It was a young man writhing in agony. He kept catching at his stomach, and at intervals he would suddenly sit up as if he were going to go mad with pain. He has had a deadly blow right on the abdomen, they said, and he has been vomiting blood. He has also had his testicles severely squeezed, which has shattered his nerves. They fetched ice and applied it to the head and damaged parts, which gradually soothed him. And so we went on from this house to another, where we found still more and more wounded. Everyone to whom I talked gave the same description of fiendish beating, torturing, thirsting, and dragging, and one and all spoke with burning horror of the foul abuse and unspeakable blasphemy which the police and their Indians and English superiors had poured upon them. So this is some of the exemplary behavior of the police. What then has become of English honor, English justice? Who could dare to uphold a means of dispersing a non-violent gathering? 1. Lathi blows on head, chest, stomach and joints. 2. Thrusts with lathi in private parts, abdominal regions. 3. Stripping off men naked before beating. 4. Tearing off loin cloths and thrusting of sticks into anus. 5. Pressing and squeezing of the testicles until a man becomes unconscious. 6. Dragging of wounded men by legs and arms, often beating them the while. 7. Throwing of wounded men into thorn hedges or salt water. 8. Riding of horses over men as they lie or sit on the ground. 9. Thrusting of pins and thorns into men's bodies, sometimes even when they are unconscious. 10. Beating of men after they had become unconscious, and other vile things too many to relate. The whole affair is one of the most devilish, cold-blooded, and unjustifiable in the history of nations. India has now realized the true nature of the British Raj, and with the realization of the Raj, is doomed. The government did not protest that this description was untrue. It merely ordered Young India to deposit $18,000 as a guarantee against the publication of such articles in the future. The magazine refused because it could not. The government suppressed it and confiscated its property. That it all, we are told, for over the great sacrifice of censor has drawn the veil, lest we should be too much moved behind the censor and the veil. God knows what is happening in India. What courage and suffering, what shooting and bombing, what airplanes and tanks, what self-control of the spirit unknown in history before power and terror and guns. Meanwhile, as the printer prints these words, the Round Table Conference opens in London. All the parties of England are represented there by able men, but from India have come only unrepresentative delegates, scorned by the nation. Gandhi, Nehru, Bear at Fitz, Malviya, Patel, Sarojini Naidu, and 100 other leaders chosen by India to speak for it are in jail. What will the British do? They have the power, all the weapons of the land and sea and air, and iron control of the Hindu press, and a propaganda organization in every part of the world, subtle and influential beyond belief. They do not yet need to be just. Perhaps they will suggest to Parliament only enough liberty for India as will leave it still at the mercy of England, but will split the nationalists into those willing and those unwilling to welcome a crumb. So the British may disrupt the present movement, turn the leaders upon one another, and then, when the movement has broken up, rest on their arms until they must fight again. But then they will have to fight again. A people so aroused, so patient, and so tenacious will not forget. The play is not over. 1921 was the first act. 1930 was the second act. There will be a third.